If you hunt, fish, or recreate on public lands, you should care. If you live in close proximity to public lands, you should care. If your livelihood is dependent on public lands, you should care. So hey there, Mike with Mountain Boys. So a few weeks ago on his Buffalo Boar ammo channel, owner Tim Sundles went on quite the rant against the Forest Service. And this was all due to the fact that he knowingly and willfully violated a fire closure order on the Middle Fork of the Salmon. So he violated a closure order. He said he, confronted a Forest Service employee, literally moved a road barricade out of the way, drove to a trailhead, and parked, unloaded, saddled up his stock, and did a pack trip. And when he got back, he had a violation ticket on his windshield. Tossed it on the ground, didn't think about it, and then, Forest Service law enforcement tried to serve him with that ticket a few more times. He says he even had to dodge some federal marshals trying to serve him with the citation and everything. And I want to talk about why that rubs me such the wrong way. And part of it has to do with the fact if you're violating a fire closure, or in this case, which I think is more likely, a severity closure, and we'll talk about the differences there in a minute. But if you're violating a fire closure, you are potentially putting yourself, anybody who's with you, and other firefighters and other first responders at risk if something goes sideways. Let's talk a little bit now about the difference between a fire closure and a severity closure. From what Tim described, and I only have his description to go off of here, it sounded more like a severity closure. If the fire that was going was indeed 40 miles away, then it could be that it was a severity closure instead. Maybe not. I mean, not too sure on that fact. But regardless, a severity closure is when a few things kind of all come together that could potentially create a perfect storm. So we could have extreme fire conditions out on the landscape. We could have very, very low fuel moistures, stuff from the fine flashy fuels like grasses, your intermediate fuels like your bushes and shrubs, clear on up to your, heavier fuels. And if those fuel moistures are down in the tank, then if something were to happen and there was an ignition source, then a big chunk of that country could just go up like that. If you get perfect alignment of fuel conditions plus weather conditions plus topography, bad things happen. So violating a closure, you are putting yourself at risk. It's illegal, and it's illegal for a reason. I like to think of rules, and I really got this point driven home to me in the Air Force years ago was that rules exist for the lowest common denominator out there. And if someone's gonna do something that they're not supposed to do or be where they're not supposed to be and then do something they're not supposed to do, what are the potential implications there? With a severity closure, you know, you've got, you know, extreme fire danger in an area. It also could be that you have a combination of extreme fire danger plus limited firefighting resources to be able to respond to something if something were to happen. So if there were a start, natural or man-made, there might not be resources available to get to it in time before it becomes something a lot bigger. So let's talk about those values at risk. You know, first and foremost on that list is life. You know, people's lives can't be replaced. Then you've got property, so private property. You know, public property too. If there's things like, you know, our national parks, if there's lodges and cabins in our national parks, sure, public property in that regard. But private property, I mean, the West has seen quite the development boon. I mean, even in my lifetime, probably, you know, I started noticing it probably around 1992, 1993, and the population in my home county has more than tripled in my lifetime. So you've got more people in an area. You have more structures in an area across the landscape now. But what are some other values that could, you know, just generally be at risk out there without getting in the weeds too much here? But, you know, there's all the private property. You know, some of them are even, you know, private property in holdings, even within Forest Service and BLM areas, things like, you know, cabins, mining claims, lodges, things of that nature. We could have marked timber sales in an area. So we could have timber stands that have been cruised and marked, ready for bid, ready for harvest, or in, you know, any link in the chain there if they're going. So we've got grazing. So grazing on our public lands out west is a big thing. And a lot of ranchers depend on grazing and the forage on our public lands to run their operations. You know, you've got all the infrastructure that goes along with grazing. So you've got the fences, you've got their water developments. You know, that's in addition to just the forage, the feed out there for their livestock and their livestock themselves, if they're up on the forest or on BLM. You know, we also have fish and wildlife habitat. So there are a lot of values in any chunk of area that you're looking at. So when someone chooses to violate a closure order, to me, what that says is all the other values at risk, a lot of those other things that I just listed out, what that says is the person who's violating that closure order doesn't care about all those other values at risk, potentially, because they think they should just be able to go whenever and wherever they want at any given time, and the government can't tell them otherwise. Well, stop and think about that for a second, and then take the lowest common denominator into that too. That if enough people violated closure orders on a whim and weren't careful out there in the woods you know, flicking cigarettes or having campfires, kind of things like that you think of most generally. What values at risk are they, or what values are they putting at risk by doing that? And the list is longer probably than a lot of people would tend to think. And like I said, if someone's going to violate a closure order, in my mind, that means that person doesn't care about everybody else who has a stake in those public lands. And that's why we should care. That's why you should care. There are 340 million people plus in the United States right now. They're not making any more public land. You know, it's getting harder and harder just to get away from people. And the area in Idaho that Tim was talking about, you know, he's talking about the, you know, area in central Idaho where, well, I'd say north central Idaho, not quite Panhandle, but that area kind of, the salmon does a great big curve around. And so you're bounded on the south, kind of, you know, by, you know, kind of the Stanley, McCall area. And then you swing around on over to you know, to Tendoy, to Salmon. Then you meet up with, you know, the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness on the east. Keep going north, you know, it's really remote country. Probably clear on up, clear to the Locksaw, which is more, you know, getting into more true Panhandle territory in Idaho. And then, you know, you're bounded on the west, kind of by, you know, Snake River Valley and everything. So we got this big chunk of really, really remote, probably the most remote bit of country that we have in the lower 48 anymore. And this is where Tim was at. So if something were to start in an area like that, you know, what kind of resources would the forest, you know, be able to put on that in such a remote and rugged area? I mean, we're talking an air show. So we're talking helicopters, we're talking smoke jumpers, you know, heli-tac crews, things like that. Aviation isn't cheap on a fire. Aviation is probably the single most expensive line item for firefighting operations. So if we're at all concerned about federal spending and federal budgets and our tax dollars being used wisely, there's yet another reason not to violate a closure order and not to advocate for anybody else violating closure orders either. Just because firefighting is expensive. And yeah, so I think I hit that point home pretty good, but I think I might pretty much leave it at that. But for all the reasons I just described, that's why I will never buy anything Buffalo Boar ever again. I will never suggest it to any of my friends or family. And Tim has lost a customer now. That's just all there is to it.